Hello, everybody. We'll give folks about 30 seconds to start joining in before we get started. But it's amazing to have you all here. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's webinar, Impacts of Federal Environmental Justice Initiatives on Tribal Communities. My name is Sarah Viken, and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at ELI. We have a fantastic lineup for you today. With environmental justice being such a large focus of the Biden administration, we're seeing so many initiatives at the federal level that have potential impacts on and benefits for tribal communities. Our speakers today will discuss some of the recent developments in the last couple years and how it's impacting their work. I want to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful speakers for being here and to thank all of you for tuning in as well. After the opening presentations, we will have a roundtable discussion and we'll be taking some audience questions later on in the program. Please don't wait to submit questions. You can use Zoom's Q&A function at any time throughout the webinar, and our moderator and speakers will be able to see it. We encourage you to use the chat for any observations and comments, but please be aware that we'll be pulling discussion questions from the Q&A box. So if you want your question to be addressed, you can just pop it right in there. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on the ELI webpage for everybody to view later. It will be public for the next few weeks and members only after that. If you're an ELI member and you can't stay for the whole webinar, the recording will be available and you can find it at eli.org. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful moderator, Mia Montoya Hammersley. Mia Montoya Hammersley is the director of the Environmental Justice Clinic and an assistant professor of law at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. She is a member of the Piro Manso Chiwa Indian Tribe, Pueblo of San Juan de Guadalupe, and a Yoeme Yaqui descendant. In her work, Mia has represented conservation organizations in protecting land from extractive industries, tribes in defending and asserting their land and water rights, and communities experiencing disproportionate environmental health harms. She strives to ground her practice in the tradition of decolonial community and movement lawyering. In addition to completing her JD with dual certificates in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy and Environmental Law, Science and Policy, Mia holds a Master of Science in Water Policy from the University of Arizona. Her chapter, The Water Energy Nexus and Environmental Justice, the Missing Link Between Water Rights and Energy Production on Tribal Lands, was published in the UA Press series Indigenous Environmental Justice in 2020. In 2021, she was a recipient of the Young, Gifted, and Green 40 Under 40 Award by Black Millennials for Flint for her work in the field of environmental justice. Mia, thank you so much for moderating today's discussion, and now I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that very warm welcome. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to be here with this panel of experts. I'm joining you today from Abenaki lands, which are, the great northern lands now known as Vermont. So I wanted to begin today in lieu of a traditional land acknowledgement by just affirming that colonization is a current and ongoing experience for tribal people, and learning about and acknowledging tribal community who has been displaced from the lands that you're currently occupying is an important first step. But I encourage all of you listening in today to find actionable ways to learn about and support the tribes, tribal economic enterprises, co-management organizations, Indigenous land trusts, and individual Indigenous people in your communities. So with that, to get us started, when I talk about and teach about the history of the environmental justice movement, I always start 500 years in the past, with Indigenous people being the first to experience environmental injustice when first confronted by European colonial powers. So I think the subject of this panel is so important because in my experience, tribal nations are often left out of conversations about environmental justice because EJ can look a little bit different for tribes as sovereign nations than it does for other minority groups in environmental justice communities. So as sovereign nations that can engage in a government-to-government relationship with the United States, tribes experience EJ or they experience environmental injustice as experiencing disproportionate environmental health harms, but also experience environmental injustice as, being prevented from exercising sovereignty over their lands and waters, being denied the opportunity to earn economic benefits from doing so, and also being denied free, prior, and informed consent over decisions impacting their ancestral homelands. So that being said, today, as we listen to the panelists, we're going to think about what are the federal government's obligations under the trust responsibility to combat environmental injustices being experienced by tribal communities, particularly in light of a future of climate change impacts that threaten tribal communities, their lands, and their cultural continuity. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce our amazing panelists. First, today we have Sarah Krakow, who is the Deputy Solicitor for Parks and Wildlife in the United States Department of Interior. She is currently on leave from the University of Colorado Law School, where she is the Moses Lasky Professor of Law, specializing in Native American law, natural resources law, and environmental justice. She is widely published in those areas of law. Before joining the University of Colorado Law faculty, Professor Krakow directed CU's American Indian Law Clinic and secured permanent university funding to ensure the clinic's future. Sarah received her JD from UC Berkeley, her BA from Yale College. She clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge Warren J. Ferguson from 1992 to 93. Next, we have Wendelin Holland. Wendelin is the Senior Advisor for Policy and Tax at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. She is also the Director of Holland Consulting, LLC, where she advises at the nexus of finance, technology, and policy, focusing on early-stage clean energy and sustainability technologies, the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, and Native American communities. She has a particular experience in tax strategy and policy. She has served as Senior Advisor for Commercialization in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy from 2008 through 2011. As a member of the Senior Executive Service, Holland served in 2012 as Director for Strategic Development and Technical Partnerships at Savannah River National Laboratory, which serves DOE's Office of Environmental Management. Prior to federal service, she worked with clean energy and water startup firms. She received her JD and LLM in taxation from Georgetown Law in 2017, her MBA in finance and strategy from Kellogg School of Management in 2001, and her BA in history and studies in the environment from Yale in 1991. She is a frequent lecturer on U.S. renewable energy policy and Western Americana. And last but not least, we have Ada Montague Steepleton, who joined NARF in 2021 and has 10 years of experience practicing land use and water law. She has a history of seeking collaborative outcomes to legal disputes. After graduating cum laude from Vassar with a BA in urban studies, Ada began her professional career as a land use planner in Bozeman, Montana. She earned a law degree from the University of Montana, where she was honored to receive the Marjorie Hunter Brown Fellowship. Concurrent with her law degree, she earned an MS in environmental studies, focusing on watershed ecology, and a certificate in natural resources conflict resolution. She also served on the Public Lands and Resources Law Review. Upon graduating, she focused her practice on water law while working for Franz and Driscoll, PLLP, in Helena, Montana, as a senior associate. She next worked for the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, monitoring drought, serving as a water rights hearing examiner, acting as a state spokesperson in the Fort Belknap Water Right Compact, representing school trust lands, and gaining experience in federal court as amicus in various forestry-related cases. As a staff attorney out of NARF's Boulder office, Ada continues to focus her practice on water rights and land use. She also continues to seek collaborative solutions to the issues that arise out of her practice. In the last 2 years, this has led to working on issues related to co-management and co-stewardship between tribes and the federal government. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our first panelist, Sarah Krakow.
Thank you, Mia. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I'm Sarah Krakoff, currently here in the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C., although I guess when you're online, you're really anywhere. And I want to start by thanking ELI and the organizers and my fellow panelists for inviting me, organizing this, and joining me here. I'm going to talk about actions and initiatives within the Department of the Interior to address environmental justice in tribal nations. And I want to start by saying that has been for me just a huge honor to work here at the department with Secretary Holland, the first Native American to be at the head of the department, which is the holder of the trust obligation to Native nations in the U.S. The entire government has a trust responsibility to Native nations, but it's the Department of the Interior that has the Bureau of Indian Affairs and implements, you could say, on a day-to-day basis, that trust responsibility. And Secretary Holland has harnessed the president's agenda to take an all-of-government approach to environmental justice in general, and also specifically to honor the obligations to tribal nations seriously. Secretary Holland has harnessed that in a serious way. I think one of the most exciting things about being here right now is that the obligation is not seen as being channeled solely through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and that hallway, as we say here in the building. It really is the case that the other political appointees that I work with, each and every one sees themselves as having that trust responsibility, whether it's the Commissioner of Reclamation, the Director of the National Park Service, Director Sams, who's also a tribal member, the Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and all the Assistant Secretaries. And I think that's really an important step and an impressive hallmark of this administration under the president, and in particular under Secretary Holland. So I'm going to sort of march through fairly quickly the sort of big picture approach of the federal government's various documents in support of environmental justice, including responsibilities to tribes, and then funnel that down to the actions the department has taken, and then try to provide a few examples. So I'm going to start first just by talking us through, really, I suspect for this crowd, reminding us of the executive orders, the presidential actions on environmental justice that frame our the department, the actions we've taken within the department. So first, in 1994, there was President Clinton's very important executive order 12898 on environmental justice, the first presidential executive order on environmental justice. That launched the interagency working group on environmental justice, data collection, and a variety of other, step down initiatives taken within the different agencies that were participants in that working group to kind of start to internalize environmental justice obligations within the federal government. And I'm just going to fast forward to get us through the executive orders. Then there were the executive orders signed by President Biden, the first one in 2021 on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. That was, as the title suggests, a very broad EO on tackling the climate crisis in all of its aspects, but also, and very importantly, included within that, the priority of ensuring that as we transition to a clean and renewable and low carbon energy economy, that environmental justice communities are not only not left behind, but can participate in that transformation. And as a part of that was the Justice 40 initiative that was launched through that executive order, which includes that EJ communities, to the greatest extent practicable, should participate in 40% of all the benefits, funding benefits flowing from the transition. And then there was Executive Order 14096 in April of 23, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all. So more specifically, following up on the Clinton executive order and establishing EJ as a priority, including a government-wide approach that specifically mentions tribal nations, the trust obligation to tribes. So that's sort of the EO picture. You can go to the next slide, please. And then, like all the departments, we're responsible for internalizing and responding to the issues that are asked of us in these executive orders. And the department has therefore developed its own strategic plan around environmental justice, including specific obligations to tribes and tribal nations. And we have revised, this is getting a bit wonky, but it's very important if you're trying to advocate before the department to understand how all the things work in their minutia. We revised our department manual, the DM, which is, sort of the instructions internally about how we operate and priorities that we follow. And then we developed a community-based resources guide. And a lot of these are up here for you to refer to later. You can find the resources guide on the Department of the Interior website. You can also look at our department manual if you want to make sure we're operating according to our own guidelines on the department's website. And I'll just sort of, I put the DOI mission up there as a prompt just to, state the mission here out loud. And it's a way of reminding us all really how readily the EJ goals and objectives and obligations to tribes fit within the department's general mission. And the mission of the Department of the Interior is to protect and manage the nation's natural resources and cultural heritage, to provide scientific and other information about those resources, and to honor the nation's trust responsibilities or special commitments to American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and affiliated island communities. So that is the department's mission. From which these, the prioritization of justice for tribal communities flows quite naturally. So next slide, please. So, and these are just slides with our resources again for you to turn to later. I'm going to use them as a background, and also great photos of our photogenic Secretary Holland, who gets out in the community frequently to communicate with tribal nations, tribal members, and also the public more generally. But while those are up, I just want to talk you through some of the things we've done in this step-down way to further the administration's commitment to environmental justice. One, which the department promulgated fairly early on, within a year, at least of my time in the administration. I joined in the spring of 21. Is that we, together with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, adopted Secretarial Order number 3403, which is the Joint Secretarial Order on fulfilling the trust responsibility to Indian tribes in the stewardship of federal lands and waters. And in that Secretarial Order, we acknowledged, the long-standing history that predates, of course, the arrival of non-native people to the U.S. that Mia adverted to at the beginning. We acknowledge that history as the basis for all the department's bureaus, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, to work with tribes to the extent practicable to engage in co-stewardship agreements with tribes on these lands, which were their ancestral lands. And also to, where possible, facilitate taking land back into trust. In many respects, I think the co-stewardship aspect of this secretarial order is the big news. The department, already has a mission and obligation to consider taking land into trust for tribes. So that was important to reiterate. But a lot of lands are going to remain in federal government, in the federal government's hands, right? So what about for all those lands? How can we bring tribal nations back in a more integrated and holistic way to manage lands and have them contribute indigenous knowledge to management, right? How can each of the bureaus take that responsibility seriously? And so this SO is kind of the blueprint, the marching orders for all the bureaus to do that work, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture as well. so U.S. Forest Service. And there are a couple things in here worth noting. Again, I think helpful to share with advocates in terms of accountability that the federal government has imposed on itself. So it has all this, language about how we are going to prioritize co-stewardship. We're going to interpret co-stewardship broadly, from the full co-management opportunity that exists in some contexts legally to other arrangements, other co-stewardship arrangements that can be entered into with tribes, and to incorporate tribal expertise and indigenous knowledge, and to enter into a range of different kinds of collaborative agreements. So it has all of those sort of directions. And then we included these accountability mechanisms, which I'm just going to mention a couple of them. We decided to include, wherever possible, compliance with SO 3403 in employee performance reviews, right? So this is a way that we can make our own selves accountable, and it's not just writing on a piece of paper, to go ahead and comply with SO 3403. So again, that's something you can pull easily off the web, take a look at Secretarial Order 3403 and see it in all of its details. I wanted to next go over some of the things we've done to make 3403 and the broader commitment to justice for tribal communities real during my time in the administration. So this is news from the two bureaus that I work most closely with, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. And this is what we have done to respond to SO 3403, since, and this is updated as of the end of last year when we reported this in the annual reports that are due. So there right now are 50 signed co-stewardship agreements in place with tribes and Alaska Native corporations and entities or Native Hawaiian communities. There are 23 new co-stewardship agreements that are in various stages of negotiations with tribes. There are 2 co-management agreements in place, one with Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Indians and the Grand Portage National Monument in northern Minnesota, and another with the Hunatlingit and Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve in Southeast Alaska. There are ongoing negotiations on 2 more co-management agreements, and 10 self-governance contracts in place, with another one, an 11th being negotiated for tribes to enter into self-governance agreements so they can actually take on, including getting funding for managing some of the functions within our national parks. I mean, it's not just parks that has been doing this. Likewise, the Fish and Wildlife Service has entered into co-stewardship and co-management agreements with tribes in our National Wildlife Refuge System. And this is, the National Wildlife Refuge System is not as heralded as our national park system, but their lands managed and protected by the federal government for fish and wildlife resources. And like the national parks, of course, many were Aboriginal lands of tribes and still are important resources, cultural resources for many tribes, especially, with hunting and fishing rights off reservation or short of treaty rights, still hunting and fishing traditions in these fish and wildlife refuges. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has entered into 13 unique co-stewardship agreements with 18 different tribes, Alaska Native corporations, and consortia. And then more recently, that was 2022. And then in 23, we entered into 65 more co-stewardship agreements related to federal lands and waters. And I know we're also within the refuge system working out the details of some of these self-governance agreements, again, so tribes can take on an even bigger management role. So those are some of the things we're doing. And I'll just mention 2 more up close to give you details that aren't just statistics, that maybe will give some color to that broader picture. In one case, we're working closely with the Onondaga Nation in upstate New York to return land to the Onondaga Nation through a natural resources damages claim that was part of a consent decree. And this is Aboriginal land that is very important to the Onondaga Nation. and that they already are applying their traditional and indigenous knowledge to help restore the land and protect it, and not only take better care of it than Honeywell Corporation did when they engaged in a lot of pollution of that area of state, but to restore the species that depend on that land and revitalize their own traditions and culture by a relationship with that landscape. So that's one example. And then moving across to the other coast, the Pacific coast, the department and through the Fish and Wildlife Service, the refuge system is working closely with Jamestown S'Klallam Tribe to enter into a self-governance agreement that's still in progress, and also exercised its discretion and flexibility so that Jamestown S'Klallam could engage in economic development oyster farming operation within the refuge, consistent with refuge law and purposes, but also honoring the tribe's Aboriginal rights, which were divested through the Stevens treaties. And so they don't have current treaty rights, but still strong connections and traditional knowledge of how to manage that kind of an operation, consistent with the region's ecological needs. So I hope that is enough. Maybe it's more than enough. And again, thanks to my fellow panelists, and I'll just turn over the time at this point.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And Sarah Kraykoff, I apologize for mispronouncing your last name. It's so helpful to hear about all of the initiatives that this administration has taken its commitments to achieving environmental justice for tribal communities. I know that Secretary Holland's appointment was such a historic moment for the country and for Indian country, especially. I just remember the excitement in my community and among my Indigenous colleagues. So it's really exciting to hear all of the wonderful concrete actions that are being taken. I especially appreciate the intention to incorporate measures of accountability, especially because I know historically that's been such a big criticism of a lot of discretionary government action. So I appreciate hearing about things like compliance with Secretarial Order 3403 being included in performance reviews. That's I hadn't heard about that, and I appreciate hearing about that a lot. So next, we're going to turn to Gwendolyn Holland.
Great. Thank you so much, Mia. And more importantly, thank you to Sarah. That was such a fantastic presentation. And you guys at the U.S. Department of Interior are so very much in the headlines now, and really at the center of this work to ensure that the federal EJ initiatives are having good impact on tribal communities. And I really want to commend not just Interior, but also, I scanned through the participants here and see a bunch of other federal employees on the line right now. And I really want to convey praise for the great work, really, that everyone is doing within the federal government, not just within each individual agency, but also in the interagency environment. And I know that sometimes crossing over the National Mall can be very difficult, and that interagency work takes extra effort. So really want to thank you all for that. My name is Gwendolyn Holland. I serve as the Senior Advisor for Policy and Tax at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. We are a relatively new organization formed a little over a year ago. Our fearless leader, our amazing leader, our CEO, Sherry Smith, who is of Mi'kmaq descent. She'd been doing the work in Indian country for clean energy deployment for quite a long time, and assembled a bunch of us other entrepreneurs who'd been doing the work in clean energy deployment as well as in the policy side of things in Native America for a number of years. So we all kind of got together and found our own swim lanes. And I'm very fortunate that I get to focus on the federal interface with regards to federal policy and federal tax. I'm former U.S. Department of Energy myself. I ran a program called commercialization at the U.S. Department of Energy which was initially within the Clean and Green Shop and in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE, under the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, and then went on to move to one of the DOE labs and have been kind of in and around the labs ever since. But my work has been focused on Native America in earnest, roughly since 2016, when I was representing the interests of a particular family office at the camps at Standing Rock. And that was, for me, as it was for obviously so many people and so many in Indian country, a truly pivotal event that really shined the bright light on what was going on with respect to our energy development and how it was continuously, constantly within any energy sector or subsector occurring on the shoulders of, at the burden of our Native American communities. And that's been a pattern. And so with this administration, we have some amazing opportunities really to switch that around, and dozens and hundreds of very dedicated Fed employees, some of whom are on the phone right now. I saw a couple names I recognize from DOE. Nice to see you guys, who are really dedicated to this. So I want to say thank you for that. Next slide, please. I am writing to you today. I am speaking with you today from the native homelands of the Shoshone and Bannock people in what is now known as Central Idaho. This is just a little bit about us at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. As I said before, our senior leadership team is made up of a bunch of entrepreneurs in Native America who recently came together to form the Alliance. In addition to Sherry Smith and myself, we're joined by Dave Harper, who is a member of the Mojave Indian tribe, of the Colorado River Indian tribes, and he runs our tribal outreach and diversity, equity, and inclusion program. In addition, we are joined by my colleague Jennifer Ruda, who leads the technical assistance pillar, and that's sort of the core of what we do, is delivering no-cost technical assistance to tribes for, broadly speaking, the energy transition, clean energy deployment and such. And in so doing, we do a lot of the working directly with the tribes, and this is what Jen and Dave do together, working directly with the tribes to help them envision what their clean energy future looks like, and how then to access the funding. And then the funding piece is where I'd get to jump in and help out with the folks who are with a fantastic grant writing team, who are interfacing and writing a bunch of the federal and sometimes philanthropic as well grant applications for folks to deploy clean energy on their tribal lands. This is just a bit about us at the Alliance. Next slide, please. And with this, you can all tell that we did not share our slides ahead of time, because my slide here is remarkably similar to what my colleague Sarah from Interior just offered up. And for those of you who, and I'm sure there are many, many lawyers on this call and many, many people who spend their time also, like I do, applying to federal grants and such. If you're not including these executive orders in your narratives for your grant applications, you need to be doing so, because this is the hallmark of what this administration, obviously, building on previous administrations, is what, as Sarah put forth. This is really the hallmark of what this administration is putting forth. So this is what's coming out of the White House and the EOs, and then obviously is getting implemented down at the agency level. I do want to highlight the fourth EO that I have listed here, the one that was signed December 6th of last year, at the end of the White House and Interior Department's Tribal Nations Summit. That is the very long title, Reforming Federal Funding and Support for Tribal Nations to better embrace our trust responsibilities and promote the next era of tribal self-determination. It's worth unpacking that. It's worth unpacking that. You know, we've heard from our colleagues in the White House Council on Native American Affairs that they really were quite intentional. They weren't being verbose accidentally. Each word here truly is important and worth us taking a look at. Oh, thank you so much, Sarah, for throwing that EO in the chat there. It's an important one to have a look at. First off, reforming federal funding and support. So we all know there's a lot of money out there for communities, native and non-native, for clean energy deployment. But there's some barriers to them. And some of the money is not getting out the door. So what is that going to look like from our standpoint? And I'm from the nonprofit sector, from the standpoint of the tribes themselves, and from the federal government. Where do we need to be making these changes in order to get the money out the door? Some of it is very obvious and straightforward, but others are harder. And these EOs are passed in the midst of trying to reform the federal bureaucracy, which, as we all know from our founding fathers who told us that, they made the bureaucracy so stable and so structured so that it would be hard to change. And we're finding out, in fact, it is hard to change. One of the highlights, of course, is the challenges with the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office, LPO, which prior to this administration had $2 billion with a B in allocations for the Tribal Energy Loan Program, all around clean energy deployment. And then with the bipartisan infrastructure law was bumped up to 20 billion with a B. And yet we still don't have an announcement on any of those funds getting out the door. If this is a topic that is of particular interest to any of you, I would invite you to, and thank you, Katie, for throwing that in there, the new clearinghouse. The BIA clearinghouse. There's a BIA, Katie, if you want to throw that in the chat as well. I think it's like BIA/ATC or something like that. There are fantastic resources of everything that's available, but where's the gap? We've got a ton of money available and lots of programs available, but why isn't it getting out to the door to tribes? And so, some of that we can look at as structural. I'm a former Fed myself. I certainly ran competitive solicitations, and I know what those rules are all about. They're hard, and I know what the review process is all about. And I'm not sure that our federal agencies are yet including Native Americans on their review committees for the programs that are supporting tribes. In addition, are we really giving the training to those feds and contractors and external reviewers who often get hired on a contract basis to review some of these solicitations? Are we giving them the training that they need to understand Indian country and culture and processes to really understand what that restorative justice needs to look like? Now I'm going to move on a little bit here and mention what DOE, many of the federal agencies, most of the federal agencies is doing to reform that process of consultation and understanding what needs to be changed in order to better get the money out the door. DOE just went through a Herculean task. Kudos to them, to that team led by Matt Dannenberg and Wahala Johns, to revise the DOE Order 144.1 on tribal consultation, that where it squarely says that anyone whose job concerns anything that will relate to Indian country needs to have training on what tribal trust responsibility is. So we are seeing good progress along those lines. It's slow. And I will say that I think that the feds deserve and need and deserve support from those of us on the outside. And that's one of the things that we do at the Alliance. Unpacking this statement on 14112 just a little bit further, to better embrace our meaning the feds, trust responsibilities. And this is something that we talk a lot about at the Alliance with the tribal nations with whom we work, with the feds with whom we work, and certainly with the nonprofit developers, renewable energy developers with whom we work. What is trust responsibility? Not a lot of people understand what it is. We did a very unscientific informal poll in a webinar we were holding last fall, just sort of polling the attendees, tribal, non-tribal, some feds, to say, what does trust responsibility mean to you? And very few people were able to hearken to it as a federal responsibility Instead, I think the lay person, the common person's understanding of it has more to do with, I trust you, you trust me, we have a contract together, and therefore we trust one another. And that's not quite the nature of the use of the term trust in this way. The federal government took on the trust responsibility repeatedly in some, I don't remember off the top of my head what the number is, some 380 odd treaties that it took on and broke. We at the federal government took on that trust responsibility to care for tribal nations and to ensure their health and well-being. And that's not happening. It's not happening well. So really having a good understanding of what that trust responsibility is, I think, is going to go a long way. And then the next statement here around promoting the next era of tribal self-determination, what does that mean? What is a next era of tribal self-determination? If we look at the previous commonly regarded eras of federal Indian policy, they have rather unfortunate names like extermination, assimilation, a lot of stuff around the Dawes Severalty Act. None of those were about the health and welfare of a sovereign nation. And so we're really looking at a new era here. And it's really worth trying to figure out what would an era of tribal self-determination look like from the side of the feds, and the feds are what they can control. They can't control the stuff on the outside. They can encourage it, but not control it. But what does that next era really look like? And that visioning of a new era of tribal self-determination is a topic that we at the Alliance plan on really addressing, diving into in a Tribal Energy Equity Summit. And I'll throw the link for it in the chat here in just a second when I'm done speaking. A Tribal Energy Equity Summit that we are holding in Muskogee Creek Nation, just outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, March 19 through 21. And if you'd like an invitation to that invitation-only event, we would be more than happy to have a chat with you. I'll throw my email in the chat at the end here. But we're really trying to envision what does that look like, of course, within the realm of clean energy. Next slide, please. And so, as I said earlier, the EOs, the executive orders, of course, coming from the White House, and then they get funneled down into the individual agencies looking at the funding programs. I'm former DOE myself, so I very much look at the world through a DOE lens, but this applies to so many of the competitive funding programs that are coming out of the other agencies as well. And that's the notion of these community benefits plans. And the CBPs, as we call them, are a required element. They're very new to anyone who, like me, has had a career in responding to these federal grants, requiring technology companies who are doing commercialization projects, deployment projects, anything. Just about every program is requiring these community benefit plans, looking at workforce development, environmental justice, caring for the environment, working with the community, stakeholder engagement, all of those good things that go into the community benefits plans. And our friends at the Office of Economic Development and Diversity, and our friends in OSED, the Office of Clean Energy Deployment at DOE, have really been at the hallmark of making sure that these get put out. And so the administration's and the agency's intent has been really strong, but there's some challenges in implementation. And I've included two here, kind of two different ways of looking at these. First of all is requiring that the tribes themselves must write these, which, and as someone who's been helping a lot of tribes recently apply to a lot of DOE and Interior competitive grant applications, as well as those from Ag, asking a tribe to phrase what they do in terms of community benefits is sort of, they kind of look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you talking about? That's our entire existence. That's what we do in our community. Why do we have to prove to the federal government that we're working for our community? That's who we are. That's part of our culture. So it's a little bit presumptuous, in fact, of the feds to ask tribes to write those. I would argue that tribes should probably be exempt from including that information. Another requirement that tribes must put forth is that they need to have a tribal resolution that they're going to take on whatever solar project or storage project or run-of-river project, whatever clean energy deployment it must be. So tribes at the tribal government level, at the tribal council level, are required to submit these resolutions, but we don't have the same requirement of state governments or municipal governments. We assume at the federal level that if a state or a community, a city, is applying to the federal government, that community, that state has agreed to do it. But yet somehow we're requiring the tribes to have a tribal resolution, as though somehow we don't trust that that really is what the tribe wants. And that's asking for the tribes to adhere to an extra level of accountability, and a level of accountability that's antithetical to their culture. So that's one thing in particular that we're trying to take a look at here at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. The second way to look at these CBPs is that from the standpoint of mainstream, meaning non-native applicants, that they're required in some instances, or encouraged in others, to include tribal nations in their CBPs. And in this, we see a lot of what I will call the check the box exercise. Oh, they called one native guy and one native guy agreed to be on the application. Check the box, that must be good enough. Or perhaps the application included information about a tribe, but there weren't there weren't any tribe members who actually know about it. And so making sure that that relationship is indeed a genuine one is really hard. You know, sometimes a private sector company, and I've worked with many of them, have every intention of reaching out to a tribe, and no one's returning their calls, or they can't find anyone. Well, that's the problem, is that we have the problem between Native America and non-Native America, that we're not working together well in our border towns, or in these new industries that are being asked to work together. And so that's where these intermediary organizations come in. We at the Alliance do this, but there are many others that do it as well. If you and your organization or your law firm or your grant writing team, whatever is the case, is having trouble reaching a given tribe, reach out to these intermediary organizations, reach out to the feds, reach out to our friends at BIA. Keep reaching out, keep trying, attend the events that where they might be present. So it's not enough to just say, hey, we tried. You have to keep trying. Next slide, please. Let's see. Oh, capacity building. Yes. We've got an issue that one of the issues we have is that state energy offices have been funded with annual appropriations for longer than I can remember. And I'm guessing there's at least a couple attorneys on the call here who could cite chapter and verse with which era of with which year of appropriations our SEOs, our state energy offices, got funding. But there's no commensurate funding for tribal energy offices. It's unfortunate, because we're really missing the ball here. And so often it's the case that there's one or two people in a given tribal energy office. If they even have a tribal energy office, many of them have kind of ancillary offices like environment or fisheries, wildlife, natural resources, that kind of thing. So to ask an individual office to take on these aspects of replying to all these community benefits plans, replying to all the federal solicitations, it's just too much. But we see the corollaries happen on a regular basis. National Association of State Energy Offices, NASIO, run by my colleague David Terry. That's an up and going organization. They're very well funded, but we're not seeing that at the same level. And that harkens to this idea, and I have a prop here, to this idea of restorative justice, one of the ideas that we'd like to put forth is that tribal energy offices should, in fact, be funded. And this isn't my idea. There's been many others smarter than I am have been talking about this for a while. Is to, in fact, fund these tribal energy offices on roughly the same formula that the SEOs are, but to think about it in terms of restorative justice as well. Next slide, please. And I think I'm just about done here. Yes, I am about done. But I do want to talk just a moment about two things: the nuclear side of things and the tax side of things. First of all, there is a really exciting program going on right now within the Department of Energy through the Office of Nuclear Energy for consent-based siting. And there are a number of awardees for that. I believe the number's 13 awardees who are going around the country working hard to assure that consent-based siting, the process of consent-based siting, not actually placing nuclear waste somewhere, but the consent-based siting is fair. And one of the organizations that's doing great work in this area is the Good Energy Collective. They're doing a fantastic job. And I think I saw Jessica on the phone earlier here from Good Energy Collective. So if you're interested in consent-based siting, please, drop your name in the chat. We can hook you up on that. And lastly, on the tax piece, so many of us who are tax nerds, we're so thrilled with the Inflation Reduction Act that it got so much attention on direct pay and allowing nonprofits to stand up. But unfortunately, working on taxes is a new idea. And so this whole idea of working on the tax code is new, and it's a fledgling community, but we're pulling it together on a really short timeline. And so I'm sure I've gone over my time. And so I will pass it off and say thank you so much, Mia, and we look forward to questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Gwendolyn. I'm still just taking in all of that information, but the things that really stood out to me here, I think the technical assistance that your organization provides to tribes is so important. And, there's so much written about the renewable energy potential on Indian lands, and the importance of implementing those renewable energy projects in ways that are culturally harmonious. And I think I was really also excited to hear about the initiatives for trainings for federal employees working with tribes and partnering with them on these types of projects. I'm teaching federal Indian law this semester, just teaching a new group of students about the federal trust responsibility for the first time. I love that you did that poll. It's so interesting to think about if you're someone who doesn't have a background in this area, just what the phrase itself might evoke for somebody, and how important it is to have the understanding of and the historical context for why the trust responsibility exists, how deeply rooted in colonialism the doctrine of discovery is, and really understanding why tribes have the status as domestic dependent nations to begin with. So, I'm hearing a theme of understanding the past, but also visioning for the future, like you were saying. And I love that focus on visioning for a better future. So last but not least, we have Ada.
Hello. It's such an honor to be here with all of you, and thank you so much to the Environmental Law Institute for inviting the Native American Rights Fund to the conversation. My name is Ada Montague Steepleton, as was mentioned, and I'm calling in from Boulder, Colorado, which is traditionally the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribal area. And want to just take a moment to recognize the incredible importance of the relation to land. And also want to give a shout out to the internet that allows us all to connect in all these different ways and platforms. What I am going to share with you guys on the topic of environmental justice and the way that it's come across my desk in the last 2 years is in that vein of co-management and co-stewardship. This came to me, I was working on a water rights settlement compact, and one of the provisions ended up turning into a co-management agreement, and the tribe asked that we represent them in the negotiations that ensued with the Forest Service. And in doing that, I started to compile information, and learn about these types of agreements. And through that process, we then ended up creating a public repository of all that information and partnering with many others along the way. So I'm going to share with you that repository. There is, I believe Sarah has posted a link to it on ELI's website, but here it is. And I'll make sure that this gets dropped in the chat as well. But just to give you a little tour so that you know this is out there. This is definitely a work in progress. It's a fast evolving area with lots of people thinking about it and folks practicing in this area. If you have comments on this repository, criticisms, whatever, you can drop an email to this email right here that I have highlighted. That will go to Professor Monty Mills at the University of Washington and his clinic students, and they will do their best to respond. We have partnered with them in putting this repository together, as well as these other organizations that you can see the logos for here. And I'll get back to that in just a minute. But first, just to give you an idea of what all is contained here, there's a series of frequently asked questions that might be helpful to those starting to learn about this topic. You can see that the frequently asked questions cover everything from what is co-stewardship versus co-management? What happens if there's this change in administrations? Why is this important? What are treaties and the federal trust responsibility in this context? So you can go through those. Each one that pops up over here, you can jump to and then click on the summary and you get the larger download of information. So there's quite a bit there to digest. Quite helpful context. We also have a place where we will be uploading agreements. This is a work in progress because this is a bit of a nuanced area of this topic. So co-management agreements, while you might think they should be publicly available, they are also the property of those tribes. And in some instances, the agreements may deal with sensitive information that is protected from public disclosure. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a solid data sovereignty protocol in place before uploading any of the agreements, even if they're already publicly available, just to make sure that the tribes involved are aware that that their agreements will be shared in this location. And so we're working through that. However, what is useful right away, and so you'll see when you come to this part of the site coming soon for the actual agreements, we hope to have those up within the next month. So give us just a little more time on those. But what is helpful about this right now is that it provides a framework for at least 5 different buckets within which these types of agreements tend to arise. So there's the MOUs and MOAs that you may be familiar with, the Bears Ears National Monument MOU is a really great example of one of the types of agreements that falls into this bucket. There are also those that are derived from executive action or judicial decree. And that's really where these co-management agreements started, was in the Pacific Northwest as a result of the decision in United States v. Oregon that later led to the joint management of the salmon fishery in that area. And so sometimes you see them coming through. Also, executive orders will require co-management to be implemented. So just so you know, that's how they sometimes arise. In addition, there are self-governance compacts and funding agreements that can also implement co-management or co-stewardship agreements. And there's consultation policies, particularly under the National Historic Preservation Act, where Section 106 programmatic agreements could be used to, or have been used to implement co-stewardship or co-management objectives, or at least ways to talk to each other in consultation. And then there are co-stewardship contracting and funding mechanisms. These all currently fall underneath the USDA's Forest Service authorities, but there are some that arise, or co-management or co-stewardship can arise under these contexts as well. Going back to the contents of the repository, the next tab has agency authorities. We only focused on, due to capacity and funding, the land management agencies that are out there that are at the federal level who have a specific land management obligation. or purpose. But obviously, like the EPA has a rich history of working with tribes and creating unique authorities and mechanisms to do so, and a lot can be learned from their process. But for the agencies highlighted here, this is a handy tab to go to when you're like, hey, I want to know what authority my agency has, or what authority the Bureau of Land Management has for these types of arrangements. And so you can go here and get hyperlinks to all of those relevant provisions of the USC, as well as, I believe the regulations were also reviewed. Can't remember if that's this tab or another. Oh no, sorry, that's in this tab. So then there's also these background laws and regulations that can support the concept of sovereign to sovereign cooperative agreements. So ISDEA, for example, has the process of 638 contracting or self-determination contracts that can be used to implement co-stewardship and co-management goals. FLIPMA, the Good Neighbor Authority, TFPA, there's a lot of different background laws that can help create the impetus and provide the authority for engaging in these types of agreements. There's also tons of agency guidance out there. As was mentioned before, here's that Executive Order 14112 that's been mentioned already. There are other presidential directives and reports on cultivating and developing these types of agreements, not just in the current administration, but in prior ones as well. There's also plenty of departmental directives and guidance. Again, we just focused on those agencies with a land management purpose. And so you can find hyperlinks to all of those at this tab. In addition, there is some limited tribal guidance. This again is coming from the federal agency out, or the agencies out. But this clearly is a place that could be developed further, though there are a few. So if you're coming to this resource looking for tribal guidance, this is a tab that has a little bit of help here. Another area that is a little bit underappreciated, and as you can see, still in development, is the land planning efforts of these agencies. And in these planning efforts, say a forest-wide planning effort or plan revision effort, there's an opportunity for tribes to get in at the forefront of any plan implementation processes and establish their desired outcomes, their goals and objectives in a concrete way that can really set the table for a long period of better integration, better consultation, more direct and real effects on the ground of any type of desired co-management or co-stewardship objectives. There are also a couple of tabs that deal with discrete topics that often come up under this umbrella of co-stewardship and co-management, such as tribal consultation, public disclosure, the use of indigenous knowledge and the co-production of knowledge, dispute resolution, and sacred places. I'm not going to go into each of those, but just wanted to highlight them so that you know that this is a resource where you can go to learn more. On the same topic, there is a wealth of scholarship out there, a lot of law review articles and other research has been done to understand various topics within this umbrella of co-management and co-stewardship. So what we did is we've tried to break them down into common themes. So you can see those themes along the left here. And let's say you're interested in examples. You can click on that tab, and here you have, including our esteemed Sarah Krakoff, work on this particular area of co-management and co-stewardship. I don't really have a whole lot more to offer you all at this point, but we are working. I do want to give a shout out to the folks who made this possible, like the NRDC. They actually gave us a chunk of their research that they had compiled over the years and made it available here, including some of the student scholarship that's available here at the bottom of all the scholarship. And I just want to give a big thanks to their participation, as well as the First Nations Development Institute. They helped us host a webinar where we met with agency and tribal representatives to just talk about what this resource would be like, how it would help, how it wouldn't. what kinds of things should be addressed. And then I want to also mention the Wilderness Society provided significant funding to allow us to hire a fellow who was able to put all this information together. Noah Lee is his name, who came to us from the Ho-Chunk tribe. And it's just been an incredible journey to put this all together and learn from all these different perspectives, but it's clearly not everything. There's a lot more that needs to be developed. And so Noah, his next part of his fellowship is going to be digging into 6 topics that we've identified as important, need to know more about topics. And so we'll be hosting those on the National Indian Law Libraries page this summer. So he's working through those now, and in the next 6 months, we'll have those ready for use as well. Basically, this is a topic that it can cut either way. There is a risk to sovereignty, and that is where the Native American Rights Fund is most centered. And so we just want to make sure that there's good information out there, and that you know, it's available to be used so that people can make good progress on this. And yeah, I guess I'm available for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ada. This is such an amazing and comprehensive resource. I just started looking through it yesterday, and I'm excited to spend a lot more time with it. I think it's going to be so helpful for so many different practitioners in this area. So thank you so much for sharing it with us today. And I especially appreciate the intention around data sovereignty protocol here as well, which is so important when making compilations like this and protecting sensitive tribal information. So with that, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I just wanted to start with one question for our panelists. So many questions to ask today, but so there's been a lot of interest in the transition away from dependence on fossil fuels and the role that tribes play in the transition to renewable energy. I wanted to ask the panelists today, you've already spoken to a lot of ways that this could happen, but how can the federal government best empower tribes as essential actors in the transition away from fossil fuels? And then to echo some of the comments that I'm seeing in the chat also, how can environmental justice be prioritized in the transition to renewable energy for tribal communities? I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at that first.
I'm happy to dive in and hope the others will chime in on top of me, please. That your two questions, those two questions kind of hit like right at the core of all of this. This is the big, you know, $20,000 question. I'll answer the second one first. Use the resources that have just been thrown at you. And I know that this is a lot. It's comprehensive. There was a lot of like wonky executive orders and funding opportunities, and you know, a bureaucratic language that can be very off-putting. It's not it's not designed to be inclusive and warm and welcoming. The language, the appropriated programs, they're designed to fit the government sphere. And so find someone who can help you kind of translate that, if you will. There are many organizations that do that work. In addition, you've got your colleagues in the excuse me, in the various federal agencies whose job it is to make this work. I believe Lisa Serrano from DOE just put her information in the chat. She works for the Tribal Affairs Office. Every single agency has a relevant tribal affairs person. Call them. Get their email addresses. You know, throw your information in the chat here. I'm sure somebody at Interior, EPA, DOE, Ag, somebody will reply to you. The agencies are really staffing up well. So rely on the feds. They're there to do that job. And then rely on the intermediary organizations. But there's also, you know, there is a responsibility, of course, on the part of the tribes. And I'm from a non-native community as well. I'm non-native myself. In my community, in central Idaho, they're not doing a great job. of getting it together to take advantage of the federal clean energy opportunities either. So, you know, it's not just the tribes who are struggling with this. A lot of them are. One of the people put in the chat a bunch of the information about the EPA grants. There's a really big EPA program that is just rolling out now, and we at the Alliance are so pleased to be able to support Region 8, which covers basically like the eastern front of the Northern Rockies and the Northern Great Plains, the 6 states and 28 tribes they're in. These are the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers. We know it's real because it has a cute acronym called the TIC-TACs. I'll throw the information in the chat here when I'm done talking. But these federally funded programs coming out of EPA, it's a lot of money. It's like $110 million across the nation to specifically help with remote, rural, and tribal communities interface with the government. So depending on what region you're in, look up, you know, who's your EPA. The acronym is TAC. I'll put it in the chat. Find out who your awardees are. They've all been announced. Everybody's just wrapping up a big conference in Puerto Rico today about it. And it's their job actually to help you out with this. So don't hang out alone thinking that there's no one around to help. There really are resources there to help, and I'll pass it on. Thanks, Mia.
Ada, did you have anything to add? And I think Sarah had to hop off for the remainder.
No, thank you for the opportunity. I thought that was pretty comprehensive.
I'm still here, but I don't have anything to add.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I feel like Gwendolyn kind of already got to my second question, which was just, you know, for those who are maybe just getting started, what advice do you all have for a tribal leader or lawyer or practitioner who's, you know, trying to assist a tribe with leveraging federal environmental justice funding? I know Gwendolyn has talked about a lot of great resources, but what advice would you give to someone who's maybe just starting off and trying to navigate all of these opportunities?
I'll dive in. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and DOE's Office of Indian Energy offer free, paid by taxpayers, free technical assistance for exactly that kind of planning. Lisa Serrano, I don't know if you're still on. She's in DOE's Office of Tribal Affairs. She can throw her email in the chat. She can get you guys in touch with the Office of Indian Energy. And a couple of different places I've put some of the NREL folks, only with their permission, of course. I put their emails in the chat as well. They also provide free, no-cost technical assistance. We at the Alliance provide this sort of planning. It's to do the community work of connecting with your community at whatever level that means. And I don't presume to know what that means for your community. It may be at a, you know, a district level, a chapter level, whatever it is, however you kind of decide your jurisdictions within the tribe. Find out what people's goals are. Is it about jobs? Is it about sovereignty? Is it economic development? Is it about, you know, growth, you know, fostering youth to stay at home? You know, what are those reasons that you want to do clean energy? And then figure out, okay, at what scale do you want to be involved? We've got the EPA rolling out any day now. There's Solar for All and the 2 other flavors of the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. That are coming out soon, and that will be a lot of money being kicked out the door to infuse renewable energy projects at both the residential community scale, and then there's a lot of funding available as well for the larger utility scale. So at what level do you want to play? Is it about putting solar on every roof or community center, what have you? Or do you want to play in the utility game? Figure out where you want to go. And those are hard questions. I don't mean to sort of make them simple. They're hard questions to ask and answer. And go from there. And then figure out where do you want the funding from, and how big of a role do you want to play in it? And there's resources out there to help. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a helpful starting point for sure. Kind of narrows the field at least a little bit.
I just have a quick addendum. It's not as specific as that, sort of general advice, thoughts I've had since working here at Interior, that I'm longing to pass on to tribes and their advocates. One is to, in addition to all the things and resources that Wendelin just mentioned, it's a relationship building piece. I would say seek out and cultivate relationships with the career folks in whatever bureau it is you're trying to get resources, support, and money from. Because there are in every bureau, in the Bureau of Reclamation, in the Bureau of Land Management, in Fish and Wildlife Service, there are going to be people who are just really good people who know their bureau inside and out, and want to help and support tribes. Will not be everybody, but there are people, and they stay, and we politicals come and go. And if you have those relationships with my extremely hardworking and knowledgeable career colleagues, then you'll have someone to turn to help you sort through the notice of funding opportunity. You'll have someone to ask about the technical questions, in addition to all the other resources that are out there online and through consultants and nonprofits. There's nothing that is quite as helpful as having someone on the inside helping walk you through. And then you cultivate an ally who, even if the administration's moment is not your moment, they're ready there to help and support you when the people in the temp positions like me are there, right? So it's sort of maximizing your opportunities by cultivating those relationships with the career folks in the different bureaus, because every tribe's needs, of course, are different. And for some, the transition will mean an energy project, right? And for some, it will mean, again, water. Reclamation has a lot of resources and a lot of money. Nobody in the West has a lot of water, but there's a lot you can do with some of the funding opportunities through drought. So I just wanted to kind of provide that a general approach tip.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to this one a little bit, though it's not directly related to the energy piece, but in terms of seeing the claiming or asserting the sovereign relationship to land through a variety of exercises can be really valuable. And one of the things that we've been hearing more and more about is something that I guess is being called an eco-cultural stewardship plan. So a tribe drafts this plan for an area that they have a historic relationship with, and regardless of ownership. And then they work with those other landowners to achieve the goals of that plan. And this can cut down on consultation arduousness because the plan already speaks to those pieces that other, say, land managers like a federal agency are working through their system on. And it can open up the door for other types of conservation goals of that particular tribe. So if it's zoning or energy development or carbon sequestration, or maybe some sort of green tourism or something like that, a food sovereignty project, et cetera, it can all get sort of brought in under one planning document that then is easily communicated around with other partners. So that's maybe something helpful to share here.
Thank you, Ada, and thank you, Sarah. I feel like in advocating on behalf of a tribe in any capacity, I think those relationships are just crucial to have and so important for building, true and meaningful partnerships over the long run as well. So I want to make sure we get to a few of the audience questions. I see two questions that kind of get at this issue, so I'll go ahead and just read one off here. So Kathy says there are more tribes that can't afford the reimbursement model of grant funding, which is the primary reason why tribes are not applying for a lot of these grants. They can't afford the upfront costs and they cannot afford the match. why can't the grants be given out in increments at the beginning of the quarter for the tribes that have limited resources? And someone else also asked a similar question about if there are any options for advanced payment rather than reimbursement for tribes.
Yeah, I think there's some stuff in the federal acquisition regulations that prevents this. And I hate to sound like one of those lawyers hiding behind the law, but I think there are some challenges. And I don't know whether those are legal challenges or rule challenges, note the nuance between the two, laws and rules. But if we as a nation were to fund the tribal energy offices on kind of sort of a similar formula that state energy offices are, that could begin to get around that. That's one answer to the question. I know it's not a satisfactory answer to the question. Secondly, there's a lot of philanthropy out there right now, and philanthropy is very well attuned to these challenges. So absolutely, it is the federal government that holds the trust responsibility. It's not the private sector that holds the trust responsibility, it's the feds. But yet we have very much seen big scale, small scale, national, regional, local philanthropy really standing up in a big way. So if you have a project and you're having trouble with that, initial feasibility or planning studies, what have you, that early stage chunk that is often the hardest, just reach out. And there are folks who can help. And both with the funding itself, as well as the planning that you're trying to accomplish. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything else to add before I move on to the next question? So Kirk asked, can you please describe the main difference between co-stewardship and co-management? There seems to be more hesitancy from federal agencies to enter into co-management agreements.
Yeah, this comes up a lot. And I think in some ways it's like different language, same thing. But okay, the discrepancy that I've been told from the agency perspective between co-management and co-stewardship is that co-stewardship is more like consultation plus, at least that's how I've been thinking of it, where the parties agree to talk to each other on a regular basis, share ideas, but the agency still determines what happens. Whereas co-management seems to be more from the agency perspective, along the lines of like, okay, we're going to agree on various protocols, bases of interacting, consultation, et cetera. And then the tribe will actually take on or a consortia will take on a certain activity, or like run the visitor center, or help with a forest treatment or something like that. So I think that is the main distinction as the federal government sees it. I think from a tribal perspective, it's more like, how do we continue to work with you and have a good relationship that we can count on? Because there's a lot of turnover and some people are easier to work with than others. And I think it's tough when you are a sovereign nation trying to affect your objectives on the land, and you're dealing with another sovereign nation, but you're dealing with like, their agencies. You're not dealing with the actual head. And so it's a bit of a mismatch. And so I think that's where some of the problems come about with either co-management or co-stewardship. It's got to really be co. And so how do you get there first? And that really comes down to relationship building.
I can just elaborate on that. It's consistent with what Ada said. I think there's sort of the technical legal difference between co-management versus co-stewardship, it's just a way of elaborating again on what Ada said. I'll get to that in a second, which is why the secretarial order used both, so as not to preclude lots of potential arrangements that could be memorialized and therefore still formalized in different ways, like through MOUs that have been referenced. So I know we're mostly lawyers, so I think it's okay to hopefully get a little wonky and excessively legal for a second. To the federal government interpreting constitutional limitations on the delegation of federal authority. The term co-management raises that issue, and for it to be a true co-management agreement, it would be a true sort of passing on of obligations that normally would be the federal government's obligations under statutes to a tribal nation. And that can happen in certain circumstances. That can happen if there's sort of clear federal direction to do so in a statute. Treaties often will provide the legal basis for a full, true co-management. But outside of those contexts, what the feds are worried about is that it will be a delegation of a federal obligation without the constitutional authority to bless that federal delegation. Okay, so then we can still do a lot. We can still share a lot of management responsibilities, tasks, knowledge, and expertise through this less formal co-stewardship arrangement, which can be, again, memorialized in a lot of different ways that doesn't trip that non-delegation concern. And so I know for me, it was helpful to walk myself through that. And then to still, be, I think and believe in a moment in the administration when we welcome all of it, right? So that there isn't this hard stop just because it can't be true, co-management. It can still be very robust, a very robust role by the tribal nation, such as, for example, through the MOU at Bears Ears and the like. And then it just to reinforce, it doesn't really matter what the label is if you don't have the commitment on either side. So just to shore up Ada's point about building up those relationships and continuity.
Great. Well, unfortunately, I think that is all the time that we have today for questions. I just wanted to thank all of the panelists again. Kirka, thank you so much. I feel like I'm coming away with a lot to think about, but also many more resources to access and to be able to share with others as well. So thank you so much for taking the time today. And thank you to the audience as well. I'll turn it back over to Sarah for some closing remarks.
Yes, that was really amazing. I'm blown away by all of the engagement, both from our amazing speakers and in the chat as well. So a huge thank you to Mia, and I want to reiterate a huge thank you to Sarah, Wendelin, and Ada for such a great discussion, sharing so many valuable resources. It sounds like this was really a needed convening, and I think we at ELI hope to do a lot more programs tackling a lot of issues that we didn't have time to get to today. So if you joined late, if you couldn't attend the full webinar, the recording will be up within a few business days on our website, as well as all of the slides, the repository that Ada shared, that's already all up. We can put the link in the chat for you before we end here. But we hope you'll come back and join us for future programming. And from all of us at ELI, have an amazing rest of your day. Bye, everybody.